Good afternoon. Thanks for joining. Good afternoon, and thanks for joining Washington, D.C.-based Jennifer Shiles and Associates and our Get Farsighted in 2020 complimentary webinar series. As you know, the FAR, or Federal Acquisition Regulations, is the rulebook that the federal government must follow when making purchases. Our webinar series pulls from contracting experts to explain each part of the FAR. It's complimentary and recorded. We will post all the recordings on our website and YouTube channel, where we have over 300 government contracting webinars available for download. A special thanks to our webinar partner in this series, the National Veteran Small Business Coalition Education Foundation. Please visit their website to learn more about the organization. We'd also like to thank our friends at Open the FAR for their sponsorship. If your organization is interested in sponsoring the series or one part, please contact hello@jennifershiles.com. And now a little bit about us. We work with primarily large businesses to help them navigate the federal marketplace. We work with both product and service companies as well as software firms. Our clients span the globe and include publicly traded organizations in a variety of sectors. We provide market analysis reports, contract administration, contract vehicle assistance, and more. All of our services can also be built into a training course for your team. Learn more about us on our website. And now we would like to let you know about some ways to reach government and government contractors through us. We offer advertising and sponsorship opportunities through our weekly newsletter and also in our webinar series. For pricing or to place an order, please email us at hello@jennifershiles.com. Now let's move on to learn a bit about today's speakers, Tamara McNulty and Allison G. Wax. You can find their information on the screen here. And today we are covering FAR Part 23 with Tamara and Allison. Thank you guys so much for joining us today. We're really thankful for your participation in the series. The floor is now yours, and please let me know when you're ready for your next slide.
All right, thank you very much. Hi, this is Tamara McNulty. I'm a partner at the law firm of Asmar, Shore & McKenna. We are a government contracts and construction law firm, boutique firm in Washington, D.C. And with me today is Allison G. Wax. She is an associate at the firm and one of our team of especially talented government contracts lawyers. So we have the job of talking to you about FAR Part 23, which is Environment and Energy and Water Efficiency, Renewable Energy Technologies, Occupational Safety, and a Drug-Free Workplace. Next slide. So we all know that the federal government has huge purchasing footprint. In any given year, they spend about $450 billion on goods and services, and $74 billion of that spent on IT equipment and services. They own or lease approximately 630,000 vehicles worldwide, and they have a huge real property portfolio of over 750,000 assets, including 275,000 buildings. Bottom line is, the government is a huge customer, and it's using this status as a huge customer to be the ideal customer in terms of purchasing goods and services that have lower environmental and energy impacts. As part of federal sustainability efforts, federal agencies are reducing their energy and environmental footprint, including through the acquisition process. Next slide. So what is FAR Part 23? It concerns the government's policies and procedures for, among other things, supporting the government's program for ensuring a drug-free workplace, protecting and improving the quality of the environment, and fostering sustainable technology, materials, products, services, and encouraging the operation of safe vehicles. It's a little bit of a catch-all in some ways. I should note here that FAR Part 23 currently references Executive Order 13423. This order was revoked by President Obama in 2015, and he had issued Executive Order 13693, which had expanded on the various sustainable acquisition policy measures. DOD, GSA, and NASA issued a proposed rule in 2017, but nothing was ever made final, and Executive Order 13423 was revoked by the new administration. But since both executive orders are revoked, FAR still references the older, 13423 still references that. We're going to talk about the FAR as it exists today. Next slide. So sustainable acquisition. The government is mandated by statutes and executive orders to purchase products with certain environmental qualities. They are effectuated generally through FAR Part 23, although there are other parts of the FAR that also deal with it. Sustainable acquisition, though, goes beyond just purchasing products. It goes to purchasing services as well. They can mandate services use sustainable products in the delivery of the services. For example, janitorial service contracts usually require the contractor to supply replacement paper towels, toilet paper, trash can liners, all of which can be mandated to be made from recycled materials. Next slide. So various subparts of FAR Part 23 implement certain of the statutory and the executive order requirements. For recycled content under RCRA, bio-based content under the 2002, 2008, and 2014 Farm Bills, energy efficient products and alternative fuel vehicles under Energy Policy Act of 1992 and 2005, building energy efficiency, alternatives to ozone depleting substances, and chemicals. So while FAR Part 23 concerns sustainable acquisition, it also includes other collateral policies such as radioactive material delivery and texting while driving, which, you know, it seems a bit of a weird place to put it, but this is, I think I call it the safe bodies portion of FAR Part 23. There are also other, like I said, there are other provisions in the FAR that touch on sustainable acquisition. We're not going to talk about those today. We're just going to talk about FAR Part 23. Next slide. So 95% of new contracts must include provisions requiring products that are energy efficient, water efficient, bio-based, environmentally preferable, non-ozone depleting, or made with recovered materials. So what do we mean by products? This means any products that are delivered to the government during contract performance, acquired by the contractor for use in performing services at a federally controlled facility, or furnished by the contractor for use by the government. New contracts refers to newly awarded contracts, task and delivery orders issued against those contracts, but it can also include new task and delivery orders on existing contracts for the purposes of meeting the 95% goal that they've set. Next slide. So what does the subpart apply to? Well, all new contracts, as I just said, but there are some exceptions. The general application is found in 23.103, and the exemptions are found in 23.104. The exemptions, the two stated exemptions are contracts performed outside the United States, unless, of course, the agency deems that it would be in the best interest of the U.S. to apply it, and weapons systems. There's also another way to get an exemption. Under FAR 23.105, exemption requests outside of the activities listed in FAR 23.104 can be considered for submission to the chair of the Council on Environmental Quality. 23.105, the activities are generally law enforcement and intelligence or national security issues. Next slide. So, energy consuming products. In 23.2, we get to talk about what energy consuming products means in the government's mind. Agencies must purchase Energy Star or FEMP designated products. They have websites which we put in the slideshow where you can go and find out what those particular products are, and the government can go there as well. For certain products that consume power in standby mode, you have to go to the FEMP's low standby power devices listing, and those products must be purchased under FEMP's standby power wattage recommendations, or document a reason for not purchasing under those terms. The general rule is that if FEMP has a designated wattage, you try for no more than 1 watt in standby power. But when it's impractical to meet the 1 watt requirement, agencies must purchase items that with the lowest standby wattage practicable. So, construction and service contracts, this one's particularly interesting to me. If the contract requires a contractor to provide energy-consuming products to the government, the agencies must specify what those products are that will comply. And the required clause in the contracts is at 52.223-15. Next slide. So 23.2 applies to all acquisitions, including those that are below the simplified acquisition and micro purchase threshold in the U.S. and its outlying areas. Agencies conducting acquisitions outside those areas, though, still should try to use their best effort. FAR 23.2 prescribes policies and procedures for acquiring energy and water efficient products and services, and products that use renewable energy technology, and using energy savings performance contracts to obtain energy efficient technologies at the government facilities without government capital expense. You can find the applicable language at FAR 23.200, and the exemptions are found in FAR 23.204. Next slide. So energy savings performance contracts are of particular interest to me. I've had a few ESPC contractors, ESCOs, in my time, in my practice. For those of you who don't know the way energy savings performance contracting works, generally the government contracts with the ESCO to provide upgrades to various facilities or parts of facilities like the HVAC, the lighting, to achieve energy savings. So they start from a baseline energy consumption of the current building as it stands. The ESCO then provides the upgrades at its expense. So there's no government allocation of money allowed. But then the contractor is then paid back over a term of years from the savings that it created. So the difference between what the energy output used to be versus what it is now. That's how they get paid back. So because of this, because these are long-term contracts, the other thing you need to know is that ESPCs are subject to subpart 17.1 of the FAR regarding multi-year contracting. So with that said, I'm going to hand it over to Allison to tell you about the other parts of FAR 23.
Thank you, Tamara. So the provisions that we're going to hit from here on out are a pretty good mixed bag of sustainable acquisition, which really dominated the first part of this presentation, and also general contractor safety, environmental and otherwise. So Tamara used the phrase safe bodies provisions, which I think is a really good way to put it. I know we have a pretty good mix of contractor and government attendees, so also just keep in mind that these provisions impose requirements on agencies and contractors pretty evenly. So keep an eye out for the ones that you need to focus on. We're going to go through them in the order in which they appear in FAR Part 23. It seems like the government, whenever they come up with a new environment or safety type requirement, they toss it in. So they might seem a little out of order, but this is something that has become really popular over the past really 6 to 10 years. So as these new ideas are coming up or new kind of demands for safety provisions and environmental provisions are coming up, we're kind of just throwing them in as we come to them. Next slide, please. So the first one we're going to go over is the hazardous material identification and material safety data provision at 23.3. The general policy is that OSHA is responsible for requiring the government to apprise their employees and contractors of hazards they might be exposed to, conditions and precautions for exposure, and also appropriate emergency treatment in the event of exposure. This involves reporting requirements. So to accomplish this objective, the government requires that its offerors and contractors submit hazardous materials data whenever the supplies being acquired are identified as hazardous materials. This is done via material safety data sheets, or MSDSs. Now, MSDSs are always required by the apparent successful offeror before contract award if the offeror expects hazardous materials to be used at all during contract performance. Now, for all agencies other than DoD, they are also required to be submitted a second time with supplies at the time of delivery. Next slide, please. All right, heading back into the sustainable acquisition category. Tamara mentioned at the beginning that the government wants to try to be the ideal customer. So this is another example of the government using its status as a huge customer to attempt to create an increase in the demand for certain recycled or environmentally friendly products. The general rule is that agencies are required to buy recycled and environmentally friendly products to the maximum extent practicable, as long as it doesn't jeopardize the intended use of the product and also maintains a satisfactory level of competition at a reasonable price. So this is implemented by requiring agencies to buy items that are EPA or USDA designated. So what that means is that EPA and USDA each have lists of designated items. The links are available there. I understand that you might not be able to click the links, but frankly, if you Google EPA designated items or USDA designated items, they will pop up. It's very easy to find and very user-friendly. Examples of things you might find on this list, for example, EPA focusing on recycled items. We're looking at building insulation, and I'm using examples that I have come across recently because most of the government contracts I deal with are construction. So building insulation, carpet, cement, and concrete, but also think, office products, binders, clipboards, file folders, presentation folders. And when you're looking at the USDA lists of designated items, you'll see things like air fresheners and deodorizers. So, when do we actually have to buy green? And this provision applies to acquisitions of any EPA USDA designated items if the price of the designated item is more than $10,000, or, and this is where most agencies are more likely to fit, or, oh, I'm sorry, next slide, I forgot to bump it over. Or, we're in the first paragraph here, the aggregate amount paid for the designated item or for functionally equivalent designated items in the preceding fiscal year was $10,000 or more. Again, as an agency, you're more likely to fall into that latter category. You probably don't buy $10,000 worth of binders in one contract, but your agency as a whole might spend $10,000 on binders in the past year. So what do you have to do if you fall into these requirements in addition to buying green? You also have to implement an affirmative procurement program for these designated items. And so if a new item is added to an EPA or USDA list and you either already meet the threshold or you're going to meet the threshold or your purchases within the last year will meet the threshold, you have 1 year to revise your procurement program after the new designation. Generally speaking, what should your procurement program include? This is set out in pretty good detail in the FAR, but just kind of to cover the highlights, you want to look at whether or not you're going to be implementing some kind of preference program for, I say recycled and environmentally friendly, but it's really recovered materials and bio-based products. You want to make sure that you have an agency promotion program for purchasing these products. And then when you're looking at EPA designated items, you want to have a program for requiring reasonable estimates, certification, and verification of the recycled materials used in the performance of contracts. And you also want to make sure that you have annual review and monitoring of the effectiveness of the program. Also, even though this threshold is $10,000 or more, if you are required to have a program, then the program itself must provide guidance for purchases of EPA-designated items at or below the micro purchase threshold. There are exemptions to this, but those come from EPA and USDA themselves, not from the FAR. So, for example, for USDA-designated items, spacecraft systems, military equipment, etc., do not have to follow this provision. So EPA and USDA can issue blanket exemptions themselves. You as an agency cannot. Next slide, please. Okay, so now we're back into a collateral policy here, drug-free workplace. Generally, I'm going to say this loosely when we talk about what this applies to or if there are exemptions. It is the government's policy that all workplaces should be drug-free. So the fact that this might not apply to you is really only referring to the pretty hefty requirements that are imposed on you as an employer with regard to notices and programs. It is not in any way implying that the government doesn't care about drug-free workplaces below these thresholds. So this subpart applies to all contracts and modifications that require justification and approval, which is this is one of the few that applies to that can apply to modifications, even if it didn't apply to the original contract, except those that are at or below the simplified acquisition threshold. And I'm going to caveat that one because if you're an individual contracting with the government, which is not common, but it happens, this applies regardless of the monetary value of the contract or modification. This subpart also doesn't apply to commercial items contracts performed outside the United States or its territories, law enforcement agencies, which makes sense. It's kind of hard for example, DEA to come up with a good drug-free work policy. Especially, they even mentioned specifically in the FAR, undercover operations. So also, and I haven't had this one come up yet, but I could assume that this might arise. But if application of this would be inconsistent with international obligations of the U.S., I have not had that come up, but it is an exception. Next slide, please. So what do you have to do under the subpart? Again, just because you don't fall into it doesn't mean that you don't have to provide a drug-free workplace. It just means you don't have to abide by the very, very long, in my opinion, litany list of requirements under this provision. And I tried to distill it down to the two main ones. And the biggest one has to do with the publication of a statement notifying employees that unlawful drug activity is prohibited in the workplace, and also specifying what will happen for violations of this. All employees engaged in performance of the contract have to be provided with a copy of the statement, and they have to be notified that as a condition of employment, they have to abide by the terms of the statement and notify the employer in writing if they are convicted under a criminal drug statute for a violation occurring in the workplace. The employer, after receiving this notice, must take some kind of appropriate action, whether it is enrolling the employee in a drug treatment program or firing the employee. It can be any number of things. It doesn't have to immediately jump to firing. The second large requirement of 23.5 is to establish an ongoing drug-free awareness program, including support groups, encouraging people to meet and attend either AA, NA. So more detail on the specifics of the program can be found at 23.5. But these are, and again, it's a very long list of things you have to do, and really they center on these two main requirements. Violation of these provisions can result in suspension of payments, termination of the contracts, and debarment and suspension actions. Next slide, please. I'm going to run through this one pretty quick. Not a lot content-wise in there, other than if you're a contractor, you have to notify the CO prior to delivering radioactive material. So we'll just jump right on past that. Next slide, please. All right, so we're back into the Sustainable Acquisition Policy. So FAR 23.7 requires agencies to implement cost-effective contracting preference programs that promote energy efficiency, water conservation, and the acquisition of, they say, environmentally preferable products. I'm going to use the blanket term here for environmentally friendly. So again, this is one thing that's a requirement on the agency, not necessarily the contractor. You have to affirmatively implement a series of environmental objectives that are found in the FAR, and I've copied the list there. You can see, they range from the general, promoting energy efficiency and water conservation, down to the very specific, purchasing only plastic ring carriers that are degradable. Next slide, please. So how is this implemented? Well, through a grant from the EPA managed by the Green Electronics Council, they have created this electronic products environmental assessment tool. I have the website up there. Again, very easy to find if you just type it into Google as well. So the general rule is that when you are acquiring an electronic product, you have to make sure that 95% of the products that you're buying are those that fall under the Electronic Product Environmental Assessment Tool list of registered electronic products and meet the requirements there. Obviously, if there is no EPEAT standard for the product, then you don't have to do it. If the only EPEAT products do not meet your requirements, you don't have to do it. And then tying back to the exception that Tamara mentioned earlier at 23-105, if you're exempt under that provision, you also don't have to buy your electronic products using this program. If you remember, 23-105 is the exemption authority that allows agencies to exempt law enforcement and national security activities from sustainable acquisition policy, and it also allows you to request additional exemptions through the chair of the Council on Environmental Quality. So those are the exemptions. Products that you'll see on this website: computers, displays, imaging equipment, cell phone servers. The general. If you can find it in the electronics section in Best Buy, then you probably have to make sure it fits within the requirements in the registry. Next slide, please. This is another one that's pretty quick to go over. The government, its policy is to minimize buying materials and products that would contribute to the depletion of the ozone and or contribute to global warming or increase greenhouse gas emissions. So this subpart is really the government's way of implementing the requirements of the Clean Air Act into preparing making sure that it's included in specifications and your purchase descriptions. So the ways that the government is allowed to promote the Clean Air Act and require contractors to abide by the Clean Air Act in their bids is to give a preference to contractors who bid using environmentally friendly chemicals and products, or using manufacturing processes that reduce overall risks to human health or increase greenhouse gas emissions. So the question is really, when is this required? Well, the big products that affect the ozone layer are going to be those air conditioning, refrigeration equipments, products. What else? Refrigerants, fire suppressants, any kind of manufactured end product that may contain or be manufactured with ozone depleting substances. That is when the government is allowed to, or really they can do it whenever they want, but that is when they have to implement some kind of Clean Air Act requirements. Next slide, please. Okay, so environmental management systems. What is an environmental management system? So EMSs are sets of practices and processes that enable an organization, in this case the government, to reduce its environmental impact and increase its operating efficiency. An EMS generally encourages the government to continuously improve its environmental performance. agencies are required to implement EMSs at all appropriate organizational levels under FAR 23.9. So where contractor activities affect an agency's environmental management, then EMS requirements have to be included in contracts as well to ensure proper implementation and execution of the EMS itself. This is required for all contracts and solicitations for contractor operation of government-owned or leased facilities or vehicles located in the U.S. So an EMS is a bit of a circular cycle, if you can imagine kind of a flow chart of the arrows pointing in a circle, where first the agency commits to its environmental policy, then it's going to use that policy as a basis for establishing a plan that sets objectives and targets for improving environmental performance. Then it implements that plan, and then after that, the organization looks back and evaluates its environmental performance to see whether the objectives and targets are being met. If the targets are not being met, then the agency takes corrective action. So the result of the evaluation is then reviewed by top management of the agency to see if it's working. This is how an EMS would work in theory. I can't speak to whether or not this is the exact method that they're using, that agencies are using in practice, but EPA does provide this as a guideline for how EMSs should be implemented and managed. And then the cycle repeats, and the goal is continuous improvement. The most commonly used framework for an EMS is the one developed by the International Organization for Standardization, ISO. And it is, for those of you who would like to take a look, it is the ISO 14001 standard. Next slide. All right, we're staying in the facilities type category right now. So there are emergency planning and toxic release reporting requirements in the Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act and the Pollution Prevention Act. Federal facilities have to comply with those. So every new contract that provides for performance at a federal facility has to require the contractor to provide the information necessary for the federal agency to comply with those requirements. Another very short one. And next slide. So this is the most recent addition to FAR Part 23. It is the ban on texting while driving. This is one that, for those of you who have ever gotten to hear Steve Schooner speak on this one, he has some particularly choice words and very interesting thoughts on this. I'm not here to discuss one way or another whether or not this is something that belongs in the FAR, but his main point that I think is really interesting is keep in mind that the Christian doctrine provides that a mandatory statute or regulation that expresses a significant or deeply ingrained strand of public procurement policy shall be read into a federal contract by operation of law, even if it's not in the contract. Arguably, all the clauses we've talked about are Christian doctrine clauses where they are required. So his one point that he made was this is a Christian doctrine clause. And you have to include it in all solicitations and contracts. There are no exceptions to it. If you look at the actual text of 2311, it's pretty long, but we tried to distill it down here for you, that agencies must encourage all contractors and subcontractors to adopt and enforce policies that ban text messaging while driving in either company-owned or rented vehicles, government-owned vehicles, or privately owned vehicles while on official government business or performing work on behalf of the government. So this is one thing that appears to be kind of a political ad, a political insertion here, but it is required to be in your contract and will arguably be read in if not. And next slide, I think that's it. Yeah, so Tamara and I thank you for joining us. And if you have any questions about what you've seen today or any other questions generally, you can contact us at our emails and our phone number listed there. You can still reach us through that phone number even now during the COVID-19 era.
All right. Thank you guys for such a great presentation. To our audience members, we thank you again for participating with us. And if you have any questions about this part of the FAR, like Allison, you said, please contact the speakers with the information you see on the screen. And if you have any questions about federal contracting or need assistance with any of our services, please contact us directly. Thank you all again for joining us. This concludes today's webinar.